The Reverend William Leake, a graduate of Cambridge, was the perpetual curate in the parish of Holbrook in Derbyshire and author of several earnest works which strove to improve the Anglican Church. Yet before he studied theology and before he became a priest, he was a soldier, and in 1815 he was a 17-year-old ensign in the 52nd Foot. Standing to be cannonaded, he wrote in his memories of his military service. And having nothing else to do, it is about the most unpleasant thing that can happen to soldiers in an engagement. I frequently tried to follow with my eye the course of the balls from our own guns which were firing over us. It is much more easy to see round shot passing away from you over your head than catch sight of one coming through the air towards you. Though this occurs occasionally, I speak of shots fired from 6, 8, 9 or 12-pounder guns. Leake was holding one of the regiment's colours, though two flags have been carried through the battle of Verima, Corunna, Brusica, Fundus Eldoris, Cordio Regia, Bajova, Salamanca, Victoria, Nivelle, Austerlitz and Toulouse. Now little more than tattered rags on bare poles. The 52nd was the largest infantry battalion at Waterloo, with over 1,000 men in its ranks, about half of whom were Peninsular veterans. It would soon have a chance to glory, but for now it must endure the most unpleasant thing that can happen to soldiers. The Reverend Leake continues his tale. After we had been stationed for more than an hour, so far down in the front of the British positions, a gleam of sunlight falling on them particularly attracted my attention to some brass guns in the front of us, which appears to be placed lower down the French slope and nearer to us than the others. I distinctly saw the French artillerymen go through the whole motion of sponging out one of the guns and reloading it, and when it was discharged I caught sight of the ball, which appeared to be in a direct line for me. I thought, shall I move? No. I gathered myself up and stood firm, with the colours in my right hand. I do not exactly know the rapidity of which cannon balls fly, but I think 2 seconds elapsed from the time I saw this shot leave the gun till it struck the front face of the square. It did not strike the 4 men in the rear, of whom I was standing, but 4 fellows on their right. It was fired at some elevation and struck the front man about the knees, coming to the ground under the feet of the rear man of the 4 whom it most severely wounded. It rose and, passing within an inch or 2 of the coloured pole, went over the rear face of the square without doing further injury. 2 men in the first and second rank fell forward. I fear they did not survive long. The 2 others fell within the square. The rear man made a considerable outcry on being wounded, but on one of the officers saying kindly to him, "Oh man, don't make a noise," he instantly recollected himself and was quiet.
Leake's battalion was in square. They had been in reserve, but Wellington had brought them forward to the right of his line, which so far had not been attacked. Some men reported that the battle went quiet after the repulse of d'Erlon's corps and after the waste of the British cavalry that followed d'Erlon's defeat, but quiet was relative. The noise still hammered the eardrums. Hougoumont was ablaze and under siege, but for a while the French made no attempt to cross the valley. The survivors of d'Erlon's corps were being reformed on the right of Napoleon's line, readying to fight again, and Marshal Ney, who had operational command of the French forces, was now on the French left opposite the 52nd. He was on horseback, which gave him added height, and he was also on a rise of ground on the French ridge, which let him stare through his telescope at the smoke-wreathed British line. And what he saw elated him. he saw the salvation of France. He saw victory. What he really saw was a scattering of British-Dutch guns along the crest with some infantry just beyond. He would have seen the smoke of the exploding French howitzer shells that were being dropped on that infantry, but what caught his attention was what happened beyond that slaughter, and, because he was just high enough to see the ground behind Wellington's line, he saw hundreds, maybe thousands of retreating men. He saw wagons going north, he saw wounded men being carried by comrades, he saw prisoners being escorted, and he jumped to the conclusion that Wellington was disengaging his army and attempting to retreat. In short, he saw the British running away. He also knew that the last thing a good soldier did was allow an enemy to withdraw unmolested. He had made that mistake himself just 2 days before, when he had allowed Wellington to slip away from Quatre Bras unmolested. Napoleon had savaged Ney for that mistake, and Ney was not going to risk another reprimand. He could see Wellington's men strung along the road as they hurried north towards Brussels, which meant that the troops left behind on the ridge must be few and becoming fewer every minute. So this was the moment to redeem himself and to give France victory. He ordered the cavalry to charge. Initially, he wanted one brigade of cuirassiers to make the attack, and so he gave the order for almost 900 heavy horsemen with their distinctive breastplates to charge the British ridge between Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte. But the brigade commander, Lieutenant General Delort, stopped the advance. Delort protested to a fellow general that I only received orders from the general who commanded the corps to which my division belonged. During this dispute, which stopped the movement of the brigade, Marshal Ney himself arrived, seething with impatience. Not only did he insist on his first order being obeyed, but in the name of the Emperor, he demanded 2 other divisions as well. I still hesitated, pointing out that heavy cavalry should not attack infantry that was well posted on high ground, that had not been weakened and was well positioned to defend itself. The Marshal yelled, "Forwards! The salvation of France is at stake." I obeyed reluctantly. Edward Milhaud was the corps commander who should have given orders to Delort. But Milhaud himself was now caught up in the excitement of the moment. He told Delort to charge, then shook hands with the commander of the Imperial Guard Light Cavalry and urged him, "We're going to charge, join us," which he did, and so still more horsemen joined the assault. Colonel Michel Ordonez commanded the first cuirassiers and wondered whether military history contained other examples of such a mass of horsemen charging simultaneously. In fact, the famous French charge through the snows of Eylau in 1807 was almost twice as large, but Ordonez, who had been present at Eylau but could probably see little through the blinding snowstorm, nevertheless reckoned he had never seen such a mass of cavalry. The 900 had grown to almost 5,000. Marshal Ney placed himself at our head. It was 4 p.m. At first our impact was irresistible. In spite of a hail of iron which beat on our helmets and breastplates, in spite of a sunken lane above which were sighted the English batteries, we reached the crest of the heights and went like lightning through the guns. The key words there are "at first," because what was beginning was perhaps the most extraordinary passage of fighting on that extraordinary day. At first, Ordonez probably thought Ney was doing the right thing, because as his horse breasted the British-Dutch ridge, he saw the enemy baggage and massed fugitives hurrying along the road to Brussels, and he saw abandoned artillery through which the horsemen had passed like lightning, but then he saw something else. British squares. The British were not running away. Wellington was not disengaging and trying to withdraw his forces. Yes, there were men and wagons on the road, but most of the British-Dutch army was still on the ridge and they were ready to fight. The Allied guns were indeed abandoned, but that was temporary because the gunners had taken refuge inside the squares. Those guns had already taken a toll of the horsemen, sending round shot through their ranks to leave crippled and dying horses in the valley. Then they had fired canister at deadly short range before the gunners ran to the shelter of the nearest infantry square. So now it was horsemen against infantry, and every cavalryman must have known what Captain Hilt had written, that it is difficult, if not impossible, for the best cavalry to break infantry who are formed in squares. So while at first the cavalrymen seemed to have pierced the British-Dutch line, instead they were faced with the worst obstacle a horseman could encounter. The wide plateau of the ridge top was packed with squares, at least 20 of them, in a rough checker pattern, so that if a horseman rode safely past one square, he was immediately faced with another, and then encountered more beyond, and each square bristled with bayonets and spat musket fire. At that moment, the sensible thing for Marshal Ney to have done was to recognise his mistake and withdraw the cavalry from danger. But Marshal Ney was rarely sensible in battle. He believed courage and passion could drive men through any hardship, and so it might, but it would not drive horses onto the face of a square. What followed was murderous for both sides. Johnny Kincaid said of Waterloo that he had never heard of a battle in which everybody was killed, but this seemed likely to be an exception. The Allies, of course, had warning that the cavalry was coming. They had seen the horsemen massing across the valley and had time to make preparations, which is why young Ensign Leake's battalion had formed square. The artillery readied themselves too. Sir Augustus Fraser commanded the horse artillery, and he galloped to Captain Mercer. "Left, limber up, and as fast as you can. At the gallop, march." Mercer goes on. I rode with Fraser, whose face was as black as a chimney sweep's from the smoke, and the jacket sleeve of his right arm was torn open by a musket ball or case shot, which merely grazed his flesh. As we went along, he told me that the enemy had assembled an enormous mass of heavy cavalry in front of the point to which he was leading us, about 1/3 of the distance between Hougoumont and the Charleroi road, and that in all probability we should immediately be charged on gaining our position. The Duke's orders, however, are positive, he added, that in the event of their persevering and charging home, you do not expose your men, but retire with them into the adjacent squares of infantry. As he spoke, we were ascending the reverse slope of the main position. We breathed a new atmosphere. The air was suffocatingly hot, resembling that issuing from an oven. We were enveloped in thick smoke. Cannon shot, too, ploughed the ground in all directions, and so thick was the hail of balls and bullets that it seemed dangerous to extend the arm lest it should be torn off. The British and Dutch guns were deployed on the flat crest of the ridge, and the approaching French cavalry made an unmissable target. The French talked of charging and going like lightning, but few men could gallop. The charge was restricted by those great bullocks forward of Wellington's line, La Haye, Saintes and Hougoumont, and fire from those two fortresses forced the cavalrymen inwards, and the resultant pressure was so great that some horses were lifted off the ground by the animals on either side. They were advancing, too, across wet ground, uphill and through high, obstinate crops, none of which had yet been trampled flat. Mercer said that the leading cavalry came at a brisk trot. When his battery was deployed, he estimated the enemy was already within 100 yards. He ordered case shot. The very first round I saw brought down several men and horses. His 5 other guns came into action, making terrible slaughter, and in an instant covering the ground with men and horses. Still they persevered in approaching us. The first round had brought them to a walk, though slowly, and it did seem they would ride over us. We were a little below the level of the ground on which they moved, having in front of us a bank of about 1.5 or 2 feet high, and this gave more effect to our case shot, for the carnage was dreadful. It is interesting that Mercer reckons his guns were a little below the level of the ground on which they moved. He was certainly on the ridge's summit, but here the ridge is flat-topped, making a fairly wide plateau, and the British squares are set well back from the forward lip of that flatter land, which is about to become a killing ground. Mercer's battery shoot at point-blank range into the horsemen, and then Mercer quotes a French account which he was certain referred to his guns. Through the smoke, the French cavalryman wrote, "I saw the English gunners abandon their pieces, all but 6 guns stationed under the road, and almost immediately our cuirassiers were upon the squares, whose fire was drawn in zigzags. Now I thought those gunners would be cut to pieces, but no, the devils kept firing with grape, which mowed us down like grass."
Thousands of horsemen were now struggling to attack the squares, but the arithmetic was fatal to them. Assume that a British battalion had 500 men and made a square of equal sides, then each face of the square would present with 4 ranks of about 30 men each. That makes 480 men in the 4 sides of the square. The rest are officers or sergeants who are in this square's centre. Now take one side of the square. 30 men are kneeling and holding their muskets, braced and pointing outwards with fixed bayonets. 30 more men are crouching in the second rank, with their bayonets also bristling outwards. And behind them are 60 men firing muskets. 30 men take up about 52, which is the width of a notional square, but a horseman needs much more space, well over 3 feet and closer to 4, so only 14 or 15 horsemen can charge at the square's face. They can come in ranks, but the front rank cannot hold more than 15 men, and those 15 are faced by 120 men, half of whom are firing muskets. That's notional. Squares usually are oblongs, but the arithmetic still holds. If cavalry charged the square, they would be shot down. Men and horses would fall in agony, and the following horsemen would be balked by thrashing hooves and fallen bodies. The charge is reduced to chaos with one volley. Lieutenant Ailes, a rifleman, describes it well enough. The cuirassiers had charged with it in 30 or 40 yards of the square. When I fired a volley from my company, which had the effect, added to the fire of the 71st, of bringing so many horses to the ground that it became quite impossible for the enemy to continue their charge. I certainly believe that half of the enemy were at an instant on the ground. Some few men and horses were killed, more wounded, but far more greater part were thrown down over the dying and the wounded. So most of the fallen enemy had simply stumbled over the casualties in front of the ranks of the charge. And even if the volley had missed, and that often happened with inexperienced troops who tended to fire high, the cavalry still cannot charge into the face of the square because their horses will swerve away with such an obstacle. When the King's German Legion broke the squares at Garcia Hernandez, it was because the French volley killed both horse and its rider, and the dead weight of the two corpses acted like a battering ram and drove the open gap in the square's face, through which the other horsemen galloped, but the battle had been on dry, hard ground, while at Waterloo the horsemen were struggling through mud and matted crops, and had shaken by the ground shot and blasts of canister tearing through their ranks. A Royal Engineer officer took shelter in the square of the 79th and reckoned that too many men were firing high with their opening volley, because the musket balls had little effect on the cavalry, but still the horsemen swerved aside to spur along the flanks of the square, where of course they were greeted with more musket fire. And behind the first row of squares were more squares and more bayonets and more muskets. Ney had led his cavalry into a maze of death. Cavalry could break squares. It might happen by accident, as it did at Garcia Hernandez, but most likely would be fear that broke the infantry. A cavalry charge was a fearsome spectacle, big men on horses, men in breastplates and helmets and plumes, a thunder of hooves, the sight of swords and sabres raised to strike. Raw troops could panic, or squares could be ripped apart by cannon fire and musketry, offering a chance for horsemen to finish their bloody business. At the Battle of Wagram in 1809, the French chasseurs broke an Austrian square with an oblique attack that slanted into the French face, which had just fired a volley at another cavalry unit. But the feat was so rare that the colonel commanding the victorious chasseurs was immediately rewarded with promotion. Even experienced troops could feel overawed by the sight of attacking cavalry. Sergeant Major Tom Morris, whose officer's pregnant wife had walked all the way from Quatrebury to Brussels, was in the square and saw the cuirassiers come over the crest. Their appearance as an enemy was certainly enough to inspire a feeling of dread, none of them under 6 feet, defended by steel helmets and breastplates. The appearance was of such formidable nature that I thought we could not have the slightest chance with them. Rhys Howell Crownau was an ensign in the 1st Foot Guards. His battalion had been left in London to perform ceremonial duties, but young Crownau, just 3 years out of Eton College, was desperate to accompany the army to Flanders. and borrowed £200 and gambled that into £600, which would be enough to buy him horses without requesting leave, he embarked for Belgium. Now, instead of standing guard at St. James's Palace, he was on the ridge of no man. He said, could have forgotten this awful grandeur of that charge. You perceived at a distance what appeared to be an overwhelming, long-moving line, which, ever advancing, glittered like a stormy wave of sea when it catches the sunlight. On came the mounted host until it got near enough, whilst every earth seemed to vibrate beneath their thundering tramp. One might suppose that nothing could have resisted the shock of this terrible moving mass. They were the famous cuirassiers, who had distinguished themselves on most of the battlefields of Europe. In an incredibly short period, they were within 30 yards of us, shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" The word commanded, prepare to receive cavalry, had been given. Every man in the front ranks knelt, and the wall, bristling with steel, held together by steady hands, presented itself to the infuriated cuirassiers. The charge of the French cavalry was gallantly executed, but our well-directed fire brought men and horses down, and ere long the utmost confusion arose in their ranks. Again and again, various cavalry regiments, heavy dragoons, lancers, hussars, carbineers of the guard, endeavoured to break our walls of steel. Some of the French cavalry carried carbines, short-barrelled, smooth-bore muskets, which they fired at the squares. But Cronau reckoned such shots produced little effect, and the riders had small chance to reload in the melee. While the redcoats were reloading with practiced skill, our men, Cronau recorded, had orders not to fire unless they could do so on a near mass. Even the most inaccurate musket could not miss a regiment of cavalry at 20 paces, and that the men and orders to shoot at the horses because a fallen and wounded horse was a real obstacle to the riders. It was pitiable to witness the agony of the poor horses, Cronau said. And the musketry worked. Steady, relentless, pitiless volleys reduced the cavalry charge to impotence. The musket fire, Cronin said, brought down a large number of horses and created indescribable confusion. The horses of the first rank of the cuirassiers, in spite of all efforts of their riders, came to a standstill, shaking and covered with foam, at about 20 yards distance from our squares, and generally resisted all attempts to force them to charge the line of serried steel. Green-jacketed riflemen formed the square too. The rifle was shorter weapon than the musket, so it carried a longer bayonet, 23 inches of steel. Rifleman John Lewis saw the cuirassiers coming, all clothed in armour. Cronau might have had thought that the carbine fire was ineffective, but Lewis could not have agreed. We all closed in and formed a square, just like they came within 10 yards of us, and they found that they could not do good with us. They fired with their carbines on us and came to right about directly. And at that moment, a man on my right hand shot through the body, and blood ran out of his belly and back like a pig stuck in the throat. He dropped on his side and spoke to him. He just said, "Lewis, I'm done," and died directly. All this time we kept up a constant fire at the Imperial Guards as they repeated, but they often came to the right about and fired, and I was loading my rifle. One of their shots came and struck my rifle, but not 2 inches above my left hand. As I was ramming down the ball with my right hand, I broke the stock, bent the barrel in such a manner I could not get the ball down. Just at that time, a 9-pound shot came, cut the sergeant of our company right in two, and he was not above 3 file from me. So I threw down my rifle and went and took his. Cronau now compared the oncoming cavalry to a wave of the sea, and the wave, breaking on the beach the cavalry came, were balked and retreated. As soon as the horsemen had retreated from the ridge's summit, the Allied gunners ran from the squares and opened fire again. Captain Mercer double-shotted his cannons, loading a canister on the top of the round shot. The cavalry were reforming just 50 and 60 yards away. Then they charged again, and they gave the word, "Fire!" The effect was terrible. Nearly the whole leading rank fell at once, and the round shot penetrating the column carried confusion throughout its extent. Our guns were served with an astonishing activity. Those who pushed forward over the heaps of carcasses of men and horses gained but a few paces in advance, there to fall in their turn and add to the difficulties of those succeeding them. The discharge of every gun was followed by a fall of men and horses like that of grass before the mower's scythe. Yet still the French pushed on, penetrating the gaps between the squares where they cut down by musket fire. All squares were safe enough when the horsemen charged, because the squares surrounded by cavalry, the French artillery stopped firing. But as soon as the cavalry withdrew, the enemy guns started again, and because the horsemen only withdrew a short distance beyond the ridge's crest, the infantry could not lie down. So the squares were pounded with round shot and shell. The French had also brought horse artillery forward and placed them on the forward lip of the plateau, and those guns joined the bombardment. John Lewis said again, "The men that stood next to me on my left had his left hand shot by a 9-pound shot just above the elbow, and he turned around and caught hold of me, and with his right hand his blood ran all over my trousers." Sergeant Tom Morris reckoned that some of the French gunners advanced with the horsemen and turned a British cannon around and fired what he called grape shot, which was almost certainly a canister. "Our situation," he wrote, "was truly awful." Our men were falling by dozens from the enemy fire. About this time also a charge shell fell just in front of us, and while the fuse was still burning out, we were wondering how many of us it would destroy. But when it burst, about 17 men were killed or wounded. Ensign Crownau was appalled at the sights of the inside of the square. It was impossible to move a yard, he wrote. Without treading upon a wounded comrade or upon the bodies of the dead, and the loud groans of the wounded and dying were almost appalling. Our square was a perfect hospital, full of dead and dying and mutilated soldiers. The charges of the cavalry were in appearance very formidable, but in reality a great relief, as the artillery could no longer fire on us.
Astonishingly, Ney persisted with the cavalry attacks. Not one square had been broken, but still he led the horsemen back up the hill and into the tangled crossfire of disciplined musketry. And he insisted on more men joining the charge until it was almost as large as the charge at Eylau. Perhaps 9,000 cavalry were now being hurled at 20,000 infantry. Ney saw a brigade of carabiniers, men with steel breastplates, waiting in a patch of low ground near Hougoumont. Their commander, General Blanchard, had been ordered by General Kellerman not to join the madness, but, as Kellerman recalled, Marshal Ney galloped over to the brigade and lost his temper over its inactivity. He ordered it to throw itself on 7 or 8 English squares, flanked by numerous artillery batteries. The carabiniers were forced to obey, but their charge met with no success, and half the brigade was left lying on the ground. "The best of all that France possesses," General Foy said, watching in amazement as the cavalry rode again and again to its doom. "I saw their golden breastplates," a French infantry officer said to the cuirassier. "They passed me by and I saw them no more." At times the cavalry paused between the squares. They were daring the British infantry to fire because all the horsemen knew that their best chance of breaking a square was just after a volley had been fired and when the rear 2 ranks were reloading. That was how the square at Wagram had been broken, but British infantry was trained to fire by platoon or company, so that there were always some loaded muskets. The French cavalry stood no chance. They rode on past the squares, taking fire and were met by British light cavalry who waited at the rear of the infantry formations. Some Frenchmen tried to escape the return trip through the musket-splitting squares by riding clean round the back of the Hougoumont and thus back to their own side of the valley. They were cuirassiers. Their horses were tired and many were wounded. But the horsemen found a sunken lane that seemed to offer a safe way back to the French lines, except it was not safe. The lane was blocked with an abattis, and the 51st Yorkshire Battalion and a regiment of Brunswickers were waiting close by. Sergeant William Wheeler of the 51st tells what happened in a letter written to his parents 5 days later. We saw them coming and was prepared. We opened our fire. The work was done in an instant. By the time we had loaded and the smoke had cleared away, one and only one solitary individual was seen running over the brow in our front. One other was saved by Captain Jane Number Ross from being put to death by some of the Brunswickers. I went to see what effect our fire had and never before beheld such a sight in as short a space as about 100 men and horses could be huddled together where they lay. Those who were shot dead were fortunate, for the wounded horses in their struggles, by plunging and kicking, soon finished what had begun. Wheeler saw just the one survivor, but in truth there were a few more, and a French infantry major saw them return to his side of the valley. We saw smoke rising like that from a burning haystack. We ran to the place and saw 15 to 18 cuirassiers. Men and horses were distorted, covered in blood and black with mud. One sous-lieutenant had gathered these men from that terrible, lethal passage through half an army. The horses were smothered in sweat, and the smoke we had seen was nothing more than the steam from their bodies. What a dreadful charge! And still the horsemen returned, and still they were repulsed. The 14th Foot was a Bedfordshire regiment, and alone of all the British battalions at Waterloo was not a veteran of Wellington's peninsular campaigns. The commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Tidier, old Frank to his men, and his daughter wrote down her father's advice to his inexperienced soldiers as they watched the fearsome cavalry come towards them. "Now, my young tinkers," he said, "stand firm while you remain in your present positions. Old Harry himself can't touch you, but if one of you give way, he will have every mother's son of you, as sure as you are born." And that was the key, to stand firm, because as long as the square kept its cohesion, then the French cavalry was impotent, Sergeant Wheeler admired. The cool, intrepid courage of our squares, exposed as they often were to destructive fire from the French cavalry, and at the same time, or in less than a minute, surrounded on all sides by the enemy's heavy cavalry, who would ride up to the very muzzles of our men's firelocks and cut at them in the squares. But this was of no use. Not a single square could they break. Yet the French cavalry was just as brave, riding again and again through the hell of artillery fire into the murderous musket barrages. Lieutenant Black of the Royal Scots almost pitied the enemy. "It was the grandest sight you can imagine," he wrote to his father. "To see these men coming at full gallop in shining armour and shouting 'Vive l'Empereur!' with all their souls, and our men too shouting as loud as they could bawl. We gave them such a volley, their two front ranks fell to a man, and away they scampered, our man pricking them down in the most horrid manner until they rode around the side of the hill and came down on the opposite face. Here they met the same reception and faced about. To our rear, where they made their third charge with the lancers in front. The cuirassiers were nearly all destroyed. The few remaining were in rear of the lancers, They pushed the charge within 10 yards of us, but our fire was so hot they could not stand it, and they broke in the centre, and a part ran round one side of our square and some on the other. So they had the whole fire of both of these two sides, and also our front, and some of the men ran to the top of the hill and snapped them going down. And out of 500 or 600 of these most beautiful troops in the world, 5 men and 4 horses escaped. Can you believe it? But it is true, on my honour.